The Garden of Earthly Delights is a harrowing masterpiece. Heaven and hell brought to earth through a window of wood and paint. Created during the turn of the 16th century by the cryptic Dutch master Hieronymus Bosch, the Garden is a triptych that depicts the third day of creation from the wider Abrahamic mythos. The left panel is a depiction of Eden, the middle a depiction of the titular Garden of Earthly Delights, and the right, well, the right panel is a madman's mind split open with a brutal club and smeared onto canvas. Bosch's depiction of hell is one of the most culturally impactful representations for how Christians and thus the overall Western culture view the concept of hell in the modern day, alongside the pivotal works of Dante and John Milton. The Garden is a truly unbelievable work. Every square inch of it, and it has a lot of inches, is packed with detail and feverish brushwork to cram more and more symbolism into the piece. Eden, the Garden, and Hell can all be individually analyzed enough to kickstart an entire career, and a couple snobs have absolutely done that over the ages. What we're here to talk about, however, is less an act of snobbery and more an act of quality. Hieronymus Bosch's Brutal Orchestra is an absolutely phenomenal roguelike game created by the indie developers It's the Talia and Nico Delgado. It's the Talia, or Talia Mair, made numerous smaller-scale free games during game jams and other similar events, or just on her own time, before the release of Brutal Orchestra, including Perfect Vermin, Pit of Babel, and Swallow the Sea, all of which are neat little free games to play on Steam for half an hour or so if you ever have the time and are a fan of Talia's style. She also gave a fantastic talk at the Full Indie Summit about dealing with transphobic and otherwise dick-headed players as a developer, and managing to glean some meaningful feedback and insight from them, even if you don't like them. Some really great stuff, and you should absolutely check it out. Her next game, Clown Meat, is a Wario Land-style frenetic platformer smeared with blood and piss and shit, appropriately from the aforementioned clowns, made with her traditionally nasty and wonderful art style. It's coming out later this year, and I'm exceptionally hyped for it. I am of the opinion that, having played most of Talia's relevant catalog, Brutal Orchestra is by far the most well-made and profound of her works. Brutal Orchestra's gameplay is all solidly built atop a foundation comprised of two essential systems. A turn-based combat system, where each character gets one move and one action each round, and each enemy has their next action displayed in chronological order on an action bar, and the pigment system. Pigment is absolutely the most important and unique aspect of Brutal Orchestra's gameplay. There are 4 colors of pigment, and each one represents a different purpose for the character. Red pigment is for offensive damage-dealing effects, blue pigment is for defensive and healing effects, yellow pigment is used as a premium on top of other pigments for ability costs, and purple is for weird shit. All abilities in the game require some form of pigment to use, ranging from 1 to 3, and often require multiple colors to be consumed in tandem. How do you get pigment? Well, just like the money in a healthcare CEO's bank account. Anyways, you have to beat it out of your enemies. Almost every character's health bar is one of the 4 colors of pigment, and them being struck directly by you or your enemies will grant you 2 pigment of that character's color. Additionally, in order to accommodate the main character Noak's skill set and enable you to gather pigment effectively, you receive 3 yellow pigment each turn in a special bar that doesn't occupy one of your 10 spaces at the bottom of your UI. So, all's well and good, right? You slap enemies, grab their colors, and then use the colors to beat them to death. But what happens if you end your turn with too much pigment? Well, then everyone in your party takes overflow damage, proportional to their HP and how much pigment you had overflowing. A 10% minimum for 1 extra pigment might not seem like much, but overflow is a genuinely serious problem, and mismanaging your pigment supply is an easy way to flub an encounter and get wiped. A lot of enemies like Jumbleguts and Spoggles fuck with your pigment, either flooding or draining you to overflow your team and deprive you of resources, meaning success only comes from constant vigilance and intelligent use of pigment. It's a phenomenally creative system to design a game around, and Brutal Orchestra absolutely delivers on building around it. The player's strategy and combat encounters in Brutal Orchestra are also defined by a few other notable factors, including items and status effects, but those are pretty self-explanatory. Each fool, or character in your party, can equip up to 1 item that has a passive effect on gameplay, exactly like in every other roguelike, ranging from, your random pigment can be red now, to, you are holding the demon core, and if a single attack even touches your character, they will fucking explode and wipe everything on screen off of it. A lot of fun references like the jersey from Lisa and the Rorschach test clearly being, two bears high-fiving, like how could you ever think it was anything else? And a bunch of stuff referencing Talia's previous games, such as Swallow the Sea. But also a lot of items have narrative importance. All the shop items are from World War I and II, a lot of lore items are pulled directly from the Garden of Earthly Delights, etc. Status effects are things like cursed, linked, focused, frail. Temporary or permanent effects that apply benefits, detriments, or more weird shit. Most fools and enemies can apply or innately represent an effect of some kind. So, now that we've got the basics out of the way, let's move on to our colorful cast of crackheads. There's only one way to start off this section, and that's with our slightly shattered, suicidal main character, Nowak. He is, of course, always the core of the party. While every other character follows the sacred rules of Minecraft Hardcore mode, Nowak will simply go and be kicked out of the current battle upon hitting 0 hit points, returning to the party with 1 HP remaining after his death in combat. This means that after a few runs playing the game, it becomes very clear to the player that's paying attention just how useful a sacrificial pawn Nowak can be. Swapping Nowak to the position that's about to tank a mortal level attack right at the end of a fight you brought a full 5-fool party to is a phenomenal way to avoid lasting consequences for your mistakes. Nowak's kit is also extremely straightforward and understandable even from the beginning of the game. Instead of slap, Nowak has a super slippery slap. Instead of a second ability, he has a slightly superer slap, and to activate his unique focus mechanic, you can either kill a foe directly with one of his attacks, or guzzle 3 purple pigment. He's a reliable pigment sucker, ally swapper, and enemy slapper. On to Boyle and Hans. The other 2 characters unlocked by default are also about as simple as Nowak. They happen to be 2 of the most reliable and effective characters in the game at their particular roles. Boyle is an absolute machine that turns red pigment into flying gibs, and Hans is a highly effective but physically frail healer. Almost all characters other than Nowak get slap innately, a 1 yellow pigment, 1 damage direct attack, and 2 out of their 3 unique character abilities to comprise their kit, giving them a bit of extra variety. Boyle's abilities all deal damage to enemies directly. One of them deals a lot of damage to 1 enemy in front of him, 1 deals some damage and also shields his current position, and the third deals a medium amount of damage to 2 enemies, to Boyle's left and right. Boyle is a fucking house. Prime Muhammad Ali level deckoning going on here. Even though he's there from the very start, Boyle will always have your back. Hans fulfills a similar position in an opposite role. With a tiny amount of HP and the Withering passive, Hans has a difficulty healing herself, but uses blue pigment to either heal herself and 1 ally for a lot, herself and 2 allies for a little, or a bit of spice and a red pigment to inflict enemies with frail. Hans is definitively the least quirky healer gameplay-wise, and just like Boyle, she'll always be your day one and will always be a valid option. Now, as we move through more of the unlockable fools, complexity is going to get a bit more exponential. But for now, we're only adding a couple extra mechanics. Anton is one of the first damage dealers. Okay, wait, here. I'll just assign each of the characters a Marvel Rivals role. Boyle is a duelist, Hans is a strategist, and Anton is a duelist. Anton is a skittery little freak who always has to ADHD leg bounce away after using an ability, sporting a reliable source of direct damage that applies Rupture, Vicious Mockery alongside Pigment Randomization, and a slot machine shank. The fact that he always shifts around in a random direction seems like a very annoying problem, and it is. But the realization that if you move him to one of the farthest sides of the battlefield and then have him take an action, you'll always know where he'll end up and who he'll swap with. That is a crucial step down the road of understanding the game's systems, this one especially being positioning. Splig has never stopped screaming. Ever. Naturally, this makes them a decent healer alongside their true gimmick of managing pigment while race-swapping Euro Cs. All their abilities change the color of their target, whether it be flipping their own and slightly healing allies, medium healing an ally and swapping their health color to Splig's, or forcibly injecting an enemy with HRT to sabotage their upcoming target interview. They really needed that job, but Splig is two cold motherfuckers. Splig is a fantastic transformer circuit to fix pigment issues and top off allies on HP. Fennec was lost to the sweet blue spice of Walter White long ago, but the crystals growing all over his crumbling skeleton provide a great imitation of a Thorns 3 enchantment. Fennec is the first true tank he'll unlock, specializing in providing shields to himself and allies. Shields don't stick to characters, rather they stay in the space they're created in. They also don't vanish after use, instead being reduced by half of their remaining hit points rounded down until they hit 0. This makes shielding a very positioning heavy mechanic that can do a lot of heavy lifting for your survivability, but sometimes you'll just get fucked by forgetting about skittery or something. Anyways, Fennec has the passive Bone Spurs, meaning he deals damage to the opposing enemy whenever he takes any direct damage, letting him output chip damage via his own self-damage abilities and from tanking hits. His abilities can shield his own position, shield both of his adjacent allies, or deal a small amount of damage to himself to gamble and attempt to remove one of the opposing enemy's inherent traits, some of which are hugely valuable, like Parental or Divine Intervention. This makes Fennec a very effective tank, but his damage capabilities are very lacking. Usually if he's dealing damage, it's because something's going wrong and they're getting through your defenses. Although Bone Spurs is overall a useful mechanic. Arnold is fucking useless. Smokestacks is here to do two things: get big and smoke cigs. Smokestacks is the most effective pigment guzzler in the entire game, bar none, with one of his abilities outright removing all overflow pigment left at the cost of a small amount of his max HP for the current encounter. His other abilities either deal a small amount of AoE damage to all enemies, or consume pigment to transform it into shields that flank him, making him function as either a secondary shielder or chip damager, in addition to his primary role of obliterating everyone's lugs like an airline passenger from the 70s. Smokestacks is interesting. Even though he only plays with the pigment system, you'll quickly learn that only quote-unquote interacting with pigment and doing everything else secondarily can still be an extremely helpful character to have in your party. Aegon is a modern philosopher and deeply introspective mind who really captures the current state of the world. Hey Aegon, what do you think about the US threatening to invade Greenland? My thoughts exactly, buddy. Aegon has a very high HP pool, but with a twist. He is permanently dying, owing to the fact that, upon close inspection, he seems to have somehow removed his own head. This means that there is no way to heal him or restore his hit points, so he can either be viewed as a sort of powerful consumable item or a treasured resource to be protected at all costs. Aegon's abilities are fucking weird, even for Brutal Orchestra. He can deal indirect damage and shuffle enemy positions, heal an ally for a large amount at the cost of cursing them, and even resurrect an ally that died in the current encounter at the cost of purple pigment. Kind of a niche character, but picking him up and just using him to blitz through a boss fight is perfectly fine. Bimini is my favorite fool in the entire game. She is a 2-foot-tall schizophrenic weeaboo with a katana twice as long as she is that is permanently locked in a different reality to the player. She's perfect. I feel like this says a lot about me, but I'm not sure what it says. Bimini is a fairly straightforward damage dealer that outputs huge damage numbers with one major twist. She only has one hit point, no matter what. You'd think this means that she gets absolutely devastated by things like overflow damage, but it's actually the rest of your party that pays for Bimini's sins. See, Bimini permanently has the effect of Divine Intervention on her, meaning as long as there is another party member alive, all damage dealt to her from any source is automatically split and redirected as indirect damage to the other members of your team. This is complicated even further by all of Bimini's abilities giving her scars, a debuff that stacks and increases all damage dealt to the afflicted character by 1 per scar, meaning that as Bimini deals damage, she becomes more of a liability. She can either deal a large amount of damage to the opposing enemy, a large amount to both the left and right enemies, or purge all scars from herself to apply an equivalent amount of shield and occasionally refresh herself, letting her take another action that turn. She's just such a fundamentally interesting risk-reward to have in your party. When do you go in for damage? When is it worth it to risk a hit on her? When do you purge scars at the cost of your damage for the turn? She's a perfect example of even the fools with quote-unquote simple mechanics adding multiple layers of complexity to your party. Longliver is a hammerhead flatworm that occupies the bold combat strategy of Forceful Mpreg. Don't knock it, I bet if you were in a street fight and you heard, "Yo, climb inside that motherfucker," you would shit yourself inside out. Longliver doesn't have Slap or the traditional 2 out of 3 unique abilities. Instead, he always has the abilities Drink the Fluids, Unfortunate Symbiosis, and Gently Eviscerate. Drink the Fluids is a simple blue pigment, yellow pigment damaging life drain attack, but the other 2 abilities are where his unique mechanics really exist. Unfortunate Symbiosis allows Longliver to enter an adjacent ally, and Gently Eviscerate allows him to violently enter an opposing enemy. While inside an ally, Longliver grants them Mutualism, a buff that shields them equal to his max HP and heals them a small amount at the end of each turn. But while inside an enemy, Longliver applies the reverse effect of parasitism, equal to his max HP, increasing damage to that enemy and draining them for HP at the end of each turn to apply it to their parasitism level. I'm sure you can imagine the complexity of Longliver builds and turn-by-turn decision-making on him. Sometimes it's perfect to just enter an ally turn 1 as act as a perma-shield and give the party a free space to work with, or vice versa, just have him enter an enemy to slowly whittle them down, but often, micromanaging your slimy purple friend takes a lot of brain space, and intestinal space. Rags can't talk because they're busy killing God. Fair enough. The main way they perform the average JRPG plotline is through their gimmick of applying Linked to themselves and other characters. Linked is a very unique mechanic applied by some enemies that does exactly what it says on the tin. It links the health pools of all linked characters. Linked characters all take damage whenever another linked character does, and vice versa with healing. This makes Linked a very unique and strange mechanic strategically. You either want as many allies linked as possible, or as many enemies linked as possible, but you almost never want linked on both allies and enemies at the same time. Rag's abilities involve healing Rags while placing Linked on the opposing enemy and a scar, healing Rags and then immediately damaging Rags again to apply multiple scars to the opposing enemy, or applying Linked to both the left and right enemies at once. Crucial to Rags' kit is their unique Catalyst passive. Basically, Rags is permanently linked without any of the negatives of the linked condition. Damage dealt to them is also dealt to other linked characters, but not vice versa. So if Rags links enemies and then damages himself or tanks an attack, the damage gets mirror-coded right back. Definitely a really complicated but extremely high potential weirdo over here. Absolutely love Rags. Rounding out this section, Gospel is an inanimate monument dedicated to the perseverance of the living. The enemies these fools go head-to-head with are one of the best designed and most well-rounded casts of any roguelike I've ever played. Since they play along the same axes as the fools, enemies have an absolute wealth of mechanics, effects, and gimmicks to be built around, and oh boy do they deliver like fucking DiGiorno. There are enemies that just smack you around, sure, but even the simplest enemies come stapled with supporting characters, alternate moves, and pigment system mechanics. Take the humble Mung of the Far Shore, for example. Picture a Magikarp, except it was born stupid and wrong and forever locked out of evolving into a beautiful Gyarados. All it can do is shit itself and cry, much like Elon Musk on Twitter. But in the first area, Mung often come flanked by a Mudlung, or even a Mungling Mudlung, more advanced versions that inhabit human corpses and can also shield their position. They can also take multiple actions and even, mungle mid-battle, so they're a lot more diverse than they sound. And these are just the most basic enemies in the game. Moving up a rung on Jacob's ladder of complexity, we've got the Jumbleguts and Spoggles. I mentioned them earlier, but these are your staple pigment meddlers. They're all over the first two areas and have a variant for each color. Red, blue, yellow, and purple. Made of coagulated pigment, Jumbleguts are slippery little freaks that slide around the fight, dealing mild damage and flooding your team with their own pigment colors to attempt to trigger your overflow. Each Jumbleguts also has a unique attack they can do, ranging from applying Curse to the Friendly Geordie's special. Spoggles are the inverse. They also skitter around, but instead of damaging a single character, they deal minor damage to multiple fools at once and devour pigment instead of generating it. Relatively simple enemies, but they all do a lot of heavy lifting for the complexity of the pigment system and are present in a lot of encounters. The final enemy from the first area I want to talk about is the big, the huge, the massive Flarb. Flarbs are probably the first big mode enemy you'll encounter, shielding themselves and dealing AoE damage. Outside of that, they aren't too unique, unless one of their young are nearby. See, Flarbs have the parental trait, meaning if a character with the infantile trait is ever damaged while a Flarb is nearby, they go absolutely apeshit like a mother flipping a car to get her baby, dealing a fuckload of damage and adding an extra attack to the action bar for each time you tried to deletus their fetus. The problem here is that their little ankle biter Flarblets have a chance to summon more Flarbs to the encounter, and that's just a disaster waiting to happen. So do you risk the Mama Bear Rampage and go for an early infanticide, or risk it and try to take down the Flarb first? Moving to the second area of the Orpheum, things start to get a lot weirder immediately. The staple enemy of the Orpheum is this dumbass, the Music Man. They're relatively tanky, deal medium damage, and sometimes just sit there and cry. Seems pretty simple, right? Their signature move, Feel the Rhythm, completely transforms them into one of 4 different significantly more dangerous or annoying forms at random if it goes off, and these alternate forms can absolutely fuck you over if you aren't prepared. Woodwinds are annoying as hell to hit and spam you with Ruptured, making positioning a nightmare. Chordophones hit for damage alongside applying the brutal Frail condition and can fuck over your entire party's positioning in one move. And Salteries can go fuck themselves, not to mention that even if you do kill a Music Man, it has a chance of devolving into a tumor that sits on the field, reducing max HP and constricting spaces, locking your party members across from themselves. The only positive of the Music Man is just how fucking jazzy their theme becomes once they transform. Like, listen to this shit. But even the music men fear the dreaded conductor. Conductors are gigantic pillars of oozing flesh with a huge HP pool that act twice a turn to devastating effect. They'll do two of the following: hit you for medium damage and move the target around, bitch and moan, deal a lot of damage and apply the sphincter tightening status effect of Spotlight to themselves, doubling both the damage they give and receive, and even transform, much like their younger cousins, into a musical form, the reviled one-man band. This abomination can use any action from any instrument's playbook, and not only can it, it will. And not only will it is going to fucking spam them at you, gaining an extra action each turn you don't exterminatus this heresy from the surface of the earth. Leaving an OMB alone for even a single turn can cause them to scale out of control. Absolutely a high priority target. The Orpheum is fantastic, but from an encounter design standpoint, mostly consists of dealing with the various music men. The other enemies are more supplemental or straightforward designs to give the player a break, which I can absolutely respect, but as your conductor on this train ride to hell, I'm going to have to ask you to take a look out the metaphysical window. Welcome to the Garden. The Garden is a hyper-reality representation of Hieronymus Bosch's own personal hell. Let's meet some of the local fauna, shall we?
This is a mating pair of in their image. On the left is the male specimen, and to the right a blue female.
An interpretation on the degraded forms of Bosch's human residents of hell, In Their Image is one of the most creatively designed and phenomenally concepted enemies I have ever seen in a video game. Being entirely honest, one of the reasons my mind has stuck on Brutal Orchestra so much since I first played it is specifically because of this enemy. As a game designer myself, the ingenuity of this encounter is just staggering. So, the different forms, right? Male and female? Unique to these enemies are two permanent traits called Reborn and Forbidden Fruit. Reborn changes the sex and therefore color of an image when they're hit with direct damage.
Men to woman, a woman to men.
On its own, this means managing pigment might be a bit harder, right? Yeah, but Reborn's real purpose is to facilitate the other unique effect, Forbidden Fruit. If two images end the turn as opposite genders anywhere on the field, Forbidden Fruit will fuse them together into a zeitgeist. This monstrosity is a brutal enemy. Not only does it completely restore a large health bar upon fusing, it will spit out an entire screen's worth of crotch goblins, deal a shitload of damage, and even link your entire party. The average encounter with images goes like this. Okay, there's 3 of them. Focus down one of them turn 1 and slap one of the other 2 once to swap their color. Now they end with 2 hers, preventing a zeitgeist. But next turn, whoops, miscounted, or missed, or forgot about an item's effect, or Talia just reached through your computer and decided to fuck you for some reason. Now you have to deal with a full HP Zeitgeist in addition to any other enemies in the encounter, and that has definitely ruined at least half a dozen runs for me over my tenure in Purgatory. Fucking phenomenal enemy, one of my favorites of all time. The other denizens of the garden are no joke either. Most of them are directly pulled from the third panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights, such as the Giggling Minister. This fuckhead has like 5 different actions and all of them are obnoxious. It'll either skitter around 1 to 6 times shanking people, inflict Ruptured on half your party, deal a bunch of damage and destroy your fucking items permanently, or play mind games with you. Mind games does literally nothing 90% of the time, but occasionally it'll insta-kill one of your characters and deal a shitload of damage to the adjacent ones, completely ruining the run. God, I fucking hate this thing. Some more of the locals ripped straight from the painting include Choir Boys and Skinning Homunculi. Choir Boys are masochistic bellends that perform an additional action each turn for each time they take damage, leading to a masturbatory chain of self-damaging actions that either ends in them killing themselves or summoning 3 hands of God to blast your ass. Oh, and they'll put Divine Protection on the one party member that absolutely should not have it. Skinning Homunculi are a souped-up combination of some previous enemy mechanics and the Tangled Mass from Slay the Spire. They swap moves when hit, but their AoE attacks can hit an entire party for massive damage and spawn little scattering homunculi everywhere. These homunculi have infantile, making the fight into just a huge mess if they're not taken care of immediately. There are a ton more really creative enemies, but I think that's enough talking about the regular encounter for now. Now it's time to go on to the big boys, the head honchos, As with all the other aspects of Brutal Orchestra, the bosses are superbly designed. And by that I mean superbly designed to kick your fucking teeth in and post it to WorldStar. As you pave the road to hell further and further with your bad intentions, the bosses will stack previously experienced mechanics on top of each other, making for richly layered and extremely tight encounters that really emphasize just how well thought out this game is. To start with, we have the 4 bosses of the first area of the game, Far Shore: Roids, Hickory, Mobius, and Triggerfingers. The bosses are here to tutorialize you on key mechanics that other bosses build on top of. Roids is your standard Sulek phenotype Sigma grindset Jimbro. Roids is a relatively simple fight conceptually. He punch, and he punch, and he punch, and he punch again. Sometimes in there, he'll throw in a suplex that applies frail, and he'll always try to take a quick vape hit to regain some HP, but Roids' fight is all about teaching you to manage your damage output and apply pressure while still keeping up defenses. He's the first main use of the overexert mechanic, where if an enemy takes enough damage in one hit, it'll cancel one of their actions for the turn. So simply having 4 fools wail on Roids in a conga line is a very effective strategy. Next up, we've got Hickory, or the Hickories, I guess? Their main concept is pretty simple. There are 2 of them. Loads of future bosses have multiple parts, so Hickory is an excellent first step in understanding how to deal with that by checking the chronological order of the action bar. They also introduce you to proper oil and fire application. The fuel Hickory sprays you down with oil, while the fire Hickory breaks out the Boring Company flamethrower. Oh wait, never mind, this flamethrower actually fucking works. Speaking of hatred, you're gonna hate how fire works in this game. Each action taken in a space that's on fire will reduce the fire's intensity by 1 and extinguish it when it hits 0. Fire deals damage to whatever's in it at the end of their turn, and it'll deal way more damage if the target has been doused with oil. The Hickories also require you to either burst one of them down or keep their damage matched, as they both have an ability called Burning Love that makes whichever Hickory who used it regain health to match the HP of the other Hickory. A great fight about field effects, positioning, and enemy prioritization. The most boring fight of the Far Shore is this bozo, Mobius. I have never once lost a run to Mobius. I don't know if I've even had a character that wasn't a Mung die to Mobius. He's here to teach the player how to deal with spawner bosses and also manage bosses that have abnormal health colors. Most other bosses in the game are red, allowing for an easy source of offensive pigment, but in the Mobius fight, you'll have to hit the red Mungs he spawns to generate any red, and you'll be overflowing on blue. Not much else to say. Hope you have a reliable ability that uses blue pigment, or he's gonna be a slog. Finally, for the Far Shore, we've got Trigger Fingers. There are just so many fucking jokes I could make. I wrote like 9 jokes about Elon Musk, but you're smart, you get it. You can infer. Trigger Finger's fight is all about his Formless trait, causing him to change his next action whenever he takes direct damage. That means that with proper management, it's easy to slap him around until he only uses actions that won't hurt too bad, then finish him off quickly next turn. However, there's always a small inherent risk involved. Trigger Fingers has an attack called Headshot that's the first insta-kill you'll come across in the game, and either not knowing about it or forgetting he can reroll into it is an extremely annoying flub that can ruin a run early. His theme also bumps. Moving on to the bosses of the Orpheum, this is where design really starts to hum in terms of synergy. Every one of the Stage 2 bosses mixes at least 3 mechanics you've already faced before in Stage 1. Swallow the Sea's poster child, the Ouroboros, combines Hickory's multiple targets, Triggerfinger's foreseeable insta-kill attack, and Mobius's blue health bar into a hectic monster hunter encounter. Do you try and burst down the main head, or clean up the body parts first for some breathing room? The Smooth Skid is a fist-clenching encounter that crushes Mobius's enemy spawning, Roids' multiple moves, and Hickory's status application into a tumbleweed of anxiety and then flings it in your face. It'll spawn up to 4 enemy servants per turn, representing deep childhood trauma with different colors and abilities. It can also destroy its own servants to fuck with your pigment, your positioning, your healing, or your ability to remain alive. Hope you've got a lot of micromanagement abilities. Honestly, the best way to prepare for fighting Smooth Skin is probably just to download Factorio. The final boss of the Orpheum is... the Charcarian. Charcarian is a fucking nightmare that combines Roid's move spam and frenetic movement, Hickory's debuffs and field effects, and pure raw hatred into a dildo made of napalm and shoves it straight. Charcarian is a large enemy that skitters around the battlefield bashing in your team's heads and constantly applying scars that ramp up future damage each time they hit you. It's like Katamari Damacy for sadists. The ball running you down just keeps getting bigger. Oh, and even if you do get its HP to 0, it just falls into a pile of sludge and reforms itself a turn later. Absolute nail-biter of a fight. I probably lost more runs to this fuck-ass than to either of the final bosses. But we're not going to talk about those just yet. For now, we're going to go back to the very start. And oh boy, if you love Vatividya loreveds, you're going to have a blast hearing about the failed suicide of a depressed Polish painter for 10 minutes.
No big narrative surprises here, but Zdzisław Nowak, our main character, is dying. The realm we see moving around us in Brutal Orchestra is something akin to suds circling the drain. This is where the refuse and jetsam of life end up. When we're unceremoniously dropped into the Far Shore, the first thing we see is this freak, who introduces itself as Bosch. Bosch is here apparently as a sort of guide to bring Nowak through Purgatory to accomplish some nebulous task, a la Inferno's Virgil. But as we progress further and further and begin to peel back the skin of this hellish landscape, it becomes clear that Bosch is lying to us. It culminates in our encounter with this pitiful corpse, a pathetic, dying wretch that might have once been a man. Bosch urges us to kill it. It's useless, pathetic, worthless. He never would have amounted to anything, Bosch says, and it certainly never would have reached the heights of its idol, the master Hieronymus. We never would have done it. We never could have done it. Here, we have a choice. Either stomp out this weed, this pitiful corpse, or spare the wretch. If we kill it, Purgatory melts away in a rush of oil, and in a flash, it's all over. But if we choose to let the corpse live, then we really start to see, even without our eyes. The corpse rejects death, enraging Bosch, who kills Noack over and over again in an attempt to finish what it started. Bosch, our mind, wanted so desperately to end it all, to be finished with life, but it failed. In the quarry, when the skull of Zdzisław Noack was split open and smeared across the ground, he didn't die. Instead, his consciousness split into two halves, Bosch the mind and Noack the body. Zdzisław Noack as he thought and as he was. Bosch represents all the failed aspirations, the self-hatred, the mental anguish, and Noack represents Noack, the man beneath the loathing and the inadequacy and the despair. Without Bosch, Noack wanders the far shores of Purgatory with no direction, lost in the endlessness of eternity, until he hears a faint melody.
You hear that? It almost sounds like music. Almost. But does that make it music? Either way, I appreciate you saying so. You look troubled. Are you? May I take a guess? Don't know who you are anymore when you deal with the devil went sour. Well, a broken clock is right twice. And if a clock can muster that, then you'd be shocked by what a broken person can do. So this devil, do you have a name? Huh, like the painter? Hieronymus Bosch, famed artist of scary nonsense. Ears with knives sprouting from them, birds with cauldrons on their heads. Ring any bells? Easy. Maybe just tell me about yourself instead. If you had none of these worries and could just go to your happy place, what would that be like? You enjoy cutting up fish? So then you dodged my question. What do you do for fun? No, a creative. What would you paint? Let's talk about Bosch again for a second, the demon. Would you say he's also a creative? Well, what makes you say that? Have you ever loaned yourself money? You ever ask yourself to move out of the way because you were blocking the view? Yeah, you just do it. You ever ask yourself a question? No. Why would you? You'd already know the answer, but you have, haven't you? You see, we're not quite as unified as we like to think. I think this devil, this Bosch, might be you asking yourself a question the hard way. I think you need to tell yourself how you feel. You're only insane if you don't know you're talking to yourself. Knowing that reflection is you just makes you aware. You hear that? It's music. Funny. All it took was recognizing it always was. Oh, kid. We never crossed paths. We've just been in the same place.
Sometimes, the only person who can tell you what to do is you. With new resolve, we set out to find Bosch. We find him sitting alone in a puddle of misery, sodden with the fear of newcomers, outsiders in our purgatory. The things Bosch was always terrified of have manifested themselves here, in this intangible wasteland, to come for us. He tells us it's too late. The intruders represent a worse fate than death, and there is no hope. But Nowak doesn't care. He swears to Bosch that together, reunited, they can strike a path forwards through the darkness and can accomplish anything. In acknowledgement of their difference and their similarity, the two halves of Jadishwa Nowak reunite whole once more, and in doing so awaken something more ancient than thought. For now yawns the maw of the garden. Bosch's paranoia made flesh and rotted over millennia, the garden is an utterly alien place, representing the dregs of consciousness. Here, after much struggle, our duo face the final obstacle in their way. Osmond's heavens. A snake in the garden.
Don't you look at me like that. Don't you look at me like you've forgotten the unspeakable things I've done to merely stand here. The inhuman things I will do. You will say my name 1,000 tongues. A swollen sea of voices. They will speak my name, and you will tell them, you drunkenly stumble from the mortal horizon back into its grasp. I will not allow it. We will rage against all horizons. If you will not walk, I will carry you. And if you struggle, I will parade your corpse into the depths of that beast machine. Breathe deep. This you will not forget. Against all horizons.
Together, Nowak and Bosch paint their masterpiece, the artistic representation of the riven soul that was mended but still faces oblivion. An imperfect work, a flawed representation. But it never had to be perfect. It just had to be real. The work completed, the deed done, the life of Jadishwa Nowak ends not with a sickening thud, but a triumphant flourish. And so close the curtains on this brutal orchestra.
Okay. Trust. This works every time. It always works. It never doesn't work. Okay.
Isn't it like 2 a.m. or something in Spain right now? Why are you calling me?
Hey, do you have a second to talk about video
You
game
don't
Brutal
even fucking
Orchestra?
sound Spanish.
That doesn't matter.
You don't even.
Is this Talia? Do you have a second to talk about Brutal Orchestra? It is me, your good friend Nicolas Delgado. Fuck.
Do I have a second to talk about? Did you Are you like Skinwalker, like wearing
that
Nico's
doesn't matter.
PFP?
That
to,
doesn't matter. Anyways,
Oh.
so I have some questions I would love to ask you. All right. So for the people that are not as terminally online as I am, would you like to give us just kind of a quick intro to who you are and what you do?
Sure, yeah. So online, I'm most commonly known as It's the Talia, but my name is Talia Mair. I'm an independent game dev. I've been working as an independent game dev since 2020. If most likely the projects of mine that you've seen are things like Perfect Vermin or Swallow the Sea, because those really
loved
good,
Swallow the Sea.
YouTuber rounds. I also have a bunch of weird experimental projects I've made, such as Arrow Swept, Heatstroke, Pit of Babel.
Oh yeah, I played Pit of Babel a couple months ago.
Pit of Babel has a remake that's coming
seriously?
soon-ish, because that game was made in 1 month, and it had a lot of ideas I really liked, but it got the game jam treatment, and I wanted to go back.
Wow, you made that? So you made that in like 1 week?
And it was a game jam, but it kind of became like an overgrown game jam, where it was like a bit too big to be a game jam, it was a bit too small to be anything else, and also that was the 4th game I put out that year.
Jesus.
So I was like running on fumes. And then my main project, the one we're talking about, is Brutal Orchestra, but I also have an equally as big project called Clown Meat that's coming soon. Although I think people who are like really hardcore fans of mine know this, but it's probably not super common knowledge, is I'm actually not working on Clown Meat right now. I'm actually taking an interlude, and I'm working on a stopgap project. And
I did not know that at all.
Yeah, I know. The reason I'm doing that is largely because of a couple things. One, I've been working on Clown Meat since Brutal Orchestra came out, and I was hitting a point where I felt like I was creatively like drained, and it was like I'd been in the same creative space for such an incredibly long amount of time that I'm worried this is going to affect the quality of my work, and we're in that like final stretch, and I'm like, I want to just nail this. So yeah,
can you tell us anything about this project?
I can say some cool stuff that hasn't been said anywhere else about what I'm working on right now. It's a smaller project. It's going to be paid. I would say it's around roughly the size of something like Buckshot Roulette.
Oh, sick.
And it's a Western, which I've never done before.
What?
And it is going to be, like right now it's called Crawling Angels, and it's about a traveling freak show in the Wild West that features an immortal chicken that you're gonna maim and smash with hammers and shoot with revolvers, and then it's gonna regrow like Deadpool, and you're gonna do it all over again.
Sounds like Saturday night. So is this like a roguelike, like Brutal Orchestra, or
no? It's a small little experience, and it's unlike Brutal Orchestra, where our focus was like we wanted to make and with Clown Meat as well. We want to make a game where you like buy it and it is like such a complete package of things to do. But with Brutal Orchestra, that was our priority so much so that it kind of came at the cost of accessibility for like YouTubers, and it didn't get as much coverage as we would have hoped. And I think part of that is because playing Brutal Orchestra feels great when you're making like gigabrain plays in your head, but it's just like not crazy watchable.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I feel like when I play it, like 80% is just like I'm just sitting there thinking.
That is very much when I started working with Autumn West, who is the co-developer on Clown Meat. It was very much like I want to do something that is just so far in the opposite direction from Brutal Orchestra. Not because I like dislike Brutal Orchestra, but because I don't want to typecast myself. I don't want to just be like I keep making the same thing, because I mean it's so hard to be an indie dev already.
Yeah, I fucking bet.
To live off money from your art is ridiculous, and to try to do that when you're like barely 25 is ridiculous. And so the other thing I don't want to do is I don't want to find success and then just keep doing that over and over again. That's a faster way to make money, but it's like I just I'm doing all this stuff to not end up trapped in a job that I'm gonna hate. And so why would I just, trap myself? Because I mean, we made Swallow the Sea. Swallow the Sea got played by Markiplier and a bunch of really big YouTubers, and it was really exciting. And then everyone's like, "Well, make Swallow the Sea 2." Or make Swallow the Sea but bigger. And it was, it was a really hard decision to like tell everybody on that project, like, I know we found success here, but to just drop everything and just make Swallow the Sea 2 and then just do that, we're just going to end up stuck in a rut where that's just going to be the thing that we make.
What about Swallow the Sea, but it involves crypto blockchain technology? So when did you start developing Brutal Orchestra independently, and less so as like a side branch to your other projects? And then how long was that until like the 1.0 release?
So the earliest version of Brutal Orchestra is that I would go for these incredibly long walks with my girlfriend Jaden, and I would just like pitch game ideas to her when we were in high school. And I remember once just like, and a one-off, and probably nobody said Brutal Orchestra as a combination of words for a couple of years after that, was like, doesn't that sound like a cool combination of words? That sounds neat.
To be fair, and then it is very cool.
Yeah, and then it just lived in my brain. And then in late high school, somebody introduced me to the artwork of Hieronymus Bosch, because they were making, like, they were doing that thing where they're like, oh, like, what is it? Like, modern art's like so stupid, but their example was the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is like the dumbest thing they use as an example. I honestly think they were just a little bit dumb and needed something to target. When they typed in art, it was like the first thing that popped up.
Like hundreds of years off.
I remember one of their points was that it was stupid because everybody was naked in it, and I'm like, no, that.
What do you mean?
Is
the best part.
Anyways, but that I ended up seeing it, and the image just lived in my brain.
Yeah, I think it lives in
everyone's.
everyone's.
And so then we go forward in time to when I was at Vancouver Film School studying game design. And over the last couple months of being there, Edmund McMillan, the creator of Binding of Isaac and Super Meat Boy, was doing these live streams where he was showing Legend of Bumbo.
Yeah, I remember seeing that.
It's like a prequel to Isaac, but it's kind of weirdly forgotten now. And so
it wasn't super popular.
Yeah, and so I played Legend of Bumbo at PAX West, and I thought it was awful. I was like, what? This is really bad. And so then I watched these live streams of him playing it, and I was looking at it, and I was like, well, I think this is actually interesting. It's just I feel like people don't remember this, but when Bumbo launched, there was a lot of really weird design decisions. Like, none of the items had names. They were all just the picture of the item and no name. And there was this idea that players would like come up with names and share them in the community. But all that people did was somebody just cracked open the files, and it was called like Red Belt number 1. Yeah, because that's
like a whole thing.
That schoolyard mythology is dead. Like it's a beautiful thing, but it's not. And so anyways, I mean, they conceded on a lot of that, and I think Bumbo as it exists right now is a much better game than it released as. And I feel particularly bad for James ID, who is the programmer of that, because it was like his first release, but it was being held to the scrutiny of an Edmund game.
Yeah, I remember people kind of tearing it apart.
Which that's brutal. I mean, their previous game was Fingered, which was like a Flash game, basically. And yeah, it's okay. It's fun. It's got some Edmund charm. Anyway, so I was watching this, and I was like, wow, I feel like there's something here, but I feel like
there's some kind of promise.
they've missed it.
Oh, yeah, because if you look at Bumbo, that's kind of like the primordial soup of Brutal Orchestra, isn't it? Like with the pigment and stuff.
I honed in on Brutal Orchestra. I honed in on Bumbo, not even knowing what I was making yet. And I basically went, well, what do I think is good about this? And it's tickling my brain. And what about this do I think is just junk that's here because it was in Isaac? And there was a lot of things that I think were there because it was in Isaac.
Yeah, his audience is like very attached to Isaac. He's talked a lot about how that's sort of a crutch, and like a design problem. And so anyways, and I thought, well, you got the puzzle board taking up like half the screen, you've got the enemies, and you've got your one character. And I thought, well, the most interesting thing to me is what's going on with this, this mana you're building up and you're using to like do things. And that was the most interesting thing to me. And I sawed off the puzzle board. I went, okay, well, what is Legend of Bumbo without the puzzle board? And if the mana's not coming from the puzzle board, where's it coming from? And so you're beating it out of them.
Yeah, and I basically was like, well, I like damaging the enemies, and I like when blood pops out of them. So what if that was like the thing? And so I when I come up with a mechanical concept for a game, I give it like the most generic title ever. So I called this idea Ball Wizards. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
And I did this little drawing, which is unfortunate. It was like on a napkin. It was like lost to time as I was telling my friend about it. And it was like a little like wizard in like a golf cart, and it like had those things that like shoot, like they shoot baseballs that you hit with a baseball bat.
Like a pitching machine.
Yeah, it was like a wizard in a golf cart with a pitching machine, and it was like Ball Wizards. I had no intention of ever making Ball Wizards, but it was also like there was a lot of decisions that were made to just be less like Bumbo, and some of which were like, it was going to be real time originally, and it was the balls were going to physics roll around, and these are just ideas that like every project has them when you're throwing like a bunch of stuff at the wall, and we like prototyped it. And it was mechanically fun, but it was just like so unwatchable. Nico did an experiment. Nico's the programmer of Brutal Orchestra. He did an experiment reviving the real-time mode in like this weird branch you can access through the...
Yeah, I saw that on the wiki. I played it for like 30 seconds and my brain just melted. That is not for me.
Yeah, there's some people that like their brain is wired for it, but it's like even more niche than Brutal Orchestra, which like we put our heart and soul into it, but we made a niche game.
Yeah, it's not, I guess, for everybody.
And so anyways, this idea for the mechanical system that became Brutal Orchestra, pigment, it being extracted from enemies to fuel your next turn, the idea of overflow, the idea of using wrong pigment, that mechanical rule set I basically set aside and called Ball Wizards. And
Nice.
Independently of that, we were working on a game called Robo Rapture, which was my final project for Vancouver Film School. And in an earlier version of Robo Rapture, they're like, well, we need cool demon designs. And I did a draft and everyone was like, well, these designs are way too like Doom, like, like Satan horns and stuff like that. And so I went, okay, well, let me do another draft. And I leaned very much into the Garden of Earthly Delights. And they're like, well, this is cool, but it feels like really random. And once again, I'd reawoken the Bosch in my brain. I didn't stop thinking about it. We arrived at what the game ultimately looked like, where it was kind of like, it was like cute. I think we called it delightfully disturbing. It's kind of got these big sort of round features on things. I never really stopped doing that art style, but that specific flavor of it kind of terminated there. And so all of these ideas were kind of just sitting around, and then Nico and I made Swallow the Sea. I actually worked on the game design document for Swallow the Sea on my lunch breaks while working on Robo Rapture. And Nico was already graduated because he was a class ahead of me. And we were working on the prototype of it while I was still in school. And my brain's just like, oh yeah. And then so afterwards, when we finally got the opportunity to work on a larger project and we had secured a budget, the question was, well, what are we going to make? Because the big request of our publisher, Hellbent Games, is they said they wanted an 80-hour game. And it was like, oh my god, that's insane. They wanted a game that there's 80 hours of content, because one of the first things they said is they wanted a game that was in the direction of Slay the Spire, which was like at its peak of popularity at the time.
Hey, I just made a video about that and how it influenced the entire like genre of like indie publishing.
And so I don't want to say we lied to Hellbent. I mean, Hellbent has done, Brutal Orchestra's done very well with them and for them. But we very much were like, okay, we're not going to just clone Slay the Spire, because there's like tons of people doing that elsewhere.
Yeah, and most of them suck. or they're like very derivative.
A lot of them are just
not
lottery tickets that are, you know, whether they get picked up or not. And so with Brutal Orchestra, I originally wrote the narrative very much like it was a linear story, and then I basically cut out everything that like didn't work in a once we kind of decided the only way the two of us were going to reach that 80-hour like maximum for people, like 10 hours to beat the game, and then like 70 hours of like more stuff to do, was a roguelike. And I love roguelikes, so that was a very exciting prospect for me.
I'm a fan. I've played like, I don't know, 10,000 hours of roguelikes or something.
And so it was really a difficult challenge to write a narrative that it kind of had to have this repetition in it, this, you know, mulling an idea over, doing it again and again and again. Because I mean, roguelikes are weirdly stuck narratively. I haven't played games like Hades, which maybe